She arrived 11 days late, covered in mud, with a torn dress and a borrowed name. The man waiting at the station had never met her. He had only read her letters, careful, measured words from a woman who described herself as reliable, patient, and plain. What stood before him was something else entirely, something harder, something that had clearly been through hell and hadn't finished fighting yet. And before either of them could speak, before the awkwardness of two strangers pretending to be practical about love could even begin, a small voice cut through the cold frontier air. Please be our mother. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Like and stay until the end. Because what happens inside that ranch will break you before it puts you back together. The stagecoach was 3 hours behind schedule, which, by the time it finally rattled into Red Creek, felt like an insult added to 11 days of injury. Evelyn Hartwell pressed her face against the cracked leather window and stared at what was supposed to be her new life. It looked like the end of something, not the beginning. Red Creek sat low against the base of a hill that hadn't made up its mind whether it wanted to be a mountain. A row of buildings, if you were generous enough to call warped wooden planks stacked against each other buildings, lined both sides of a street that was more mud than road. A feed store, a post office the size of a bedroom closet, a saloon with a broken sign that swung in the April wind and made a sound like someone arguing with a door, a church with a missing bell. And beyond all of it, open land that stretched so far in every direction it made a person feel genuinely small, genuinely exposed, genuinely foolish for thinking she could make a new life out here. Evelyn pulled back from the window. Her reflection caught in the dirty glass, and she almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. She was 34 years old. She had been a schoolteacher for 9 years in Harlow, Pennsylvania. She had buried a husband who died before the marriage had the chance to be anything worth grieving. And she had spent 3 years afterward in the specific loneliness of a woman who didn't fit the mold of widow, spinster, or free woman. She was all three and none of them, and Harlow had never quite known what to do with her. So she had answered the advertisement. Widowed rancher, 2 children, seeking a capable woman of respectable character. Companionship and partnership offered, not romance. That last part had appealed to her more than she'd admitted to anyone. Not romance, just something real. Something useful, something that didn't require her to pretend she had more feeling left than she actually did. She had written 3 letters before sending any of them. The 4th one, careful, measured, honest about what she was and wasn't, had received a response within 2 weeks. His name was Silas Boone. His letters were short, direct, not unkind, but not warm either. He wrote like a man who had learned that words cost something, and he wasn't in a position to waste them. He described the ranch, the children, a girl of 7 named Clara and a boy of 10 named Henry, the winters, the work. He described all of it plainly, without apology, as though giving her the full accounting of what she was walking into so she couldn't come back later and claim she hadn't been warned. She had respected that about him, reading those letters in her cold room in Harlow. She respected it considerably less now, sitting in a stagecoach covered in road dust, with 11 days of poor food and no sleep behind her, staring at a settlement that looked like it had already given up. But the driver called out the stop and the door swung open before Evelyn was ready. She climbed down carefully. Her left knee had been aching since the 3rd day, when the coach had hit a rut outside of Pittsburgh deep enough to swallow the wheel, and she stood in the Red Creek mud and breathed air that smelled like rain and horses and something burning. She reached back up for her bag, and the handle chose that exact moment to give way, dropping the thing into the mud at her feet. She stared at it. She did not curse. She had promised herself she would not be the sort of woman who arrived cursing. She picked up the bag. Her trunk was unloaded from the back. The latch on the left side had broken somewhere in Ohio, and she had tied it shut with a leather cord that had since gone slack, which meant that when it landed on the ground, the trunk opened and 3 of her books slid out into the mud. One of her dresses, her second best, the dark blue wool, came halfway out before she caught it. She knelt down in the street and gathered her things. Nobody helped her. Not because the people of Red Creek were cruel. She would learn later that they were cautious with strangers, which was different. But in that moment, kneeling in the mud on the main street of a town she didn't know, packing her belongings back into a broken trunk while travelers walked past her, Evelyn felt something she recognized from her worst days in Harlow. The particular weight of being invisible, of being a woman handling a problem in public and being expected to do it quietly and without making anyone uncomfortable. She tied the cord back around the trunk. She stood up, and that was when she saw him. He was standing across the street on the raised wooden sidewalk in front of the feed store, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. He was tall, taller than she'd pictured from his letters, though she hadn't consciously pictured him at all, or so she'd told herself. He wore a dark coat, plain, practical, with trail dust on the shoulders. His hat was pulled low against the wind. He had a beard that was growing out like a man who had been too busy to deal with it rather than a man who had chosen it. He held his hat in his hands as she looked at him, which struck her as a strange small gesture for a man standing in the cold. Beside him, half hidden behind his leg, a small figure watched her with enormous eyes. Clara. And a few feet to his right, separate enough to make a statement, arms crossed, was a boy who could only be Henry. He had his father's jaw and his father's posture, straight, guarded, giving nothing away. Evelyn picked up her bag. She crossed the street. Her knee ached. There was mud on her second-best dress from the trunk incident. Her hair had given up entirely somewhere around day 7, and she had simply braided it back and pinned it and stopped thinking about it. She was not the woman from her careful letters. She was not reliable, patient, and plain. She was exhausted and dirty and quietly terrified. She stopped in front of Silas Boone and looked up at him. He looked down at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he said, in a voice that was lower than she'd expected, rougher but not unkind, "Looks like you came through a difficult road." 11 days, she said. "Heard there was flooding south of Denver. And north of it. And in it, as far as I could tell." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, nothing that committed to warmth, but something that acknowledged she had a dry sense of humor, and that he had noticed it. "You look like someone who could use a meal," he said, "and somewhere to sit that isn't moving." "That is," Evelyn said carefully, "the most accurate description of my needs that I have heard in 11 days. She meant it as the professional tone she had practiced, measured, composed, not too eager. It came out more like something close to honesty, and she saw something flicker in his eyes before he looked away. That was when Clara stepped out from behind his leg. She was small for 7, with her father's dark hair and eyes that were too serious for her face, and she looked at Evelyn with the open, uncalculated intensity that only very young children and very old people have access to. The kind of gaze that looks straight through social performance at the actual person underneath. She looked for a long time. Then she said it. "Please be our mother, Dad." The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. Henry made a sharp sound, not quite a word, something between disgust and embarrassment, and turned away, staring down the street as though the broken saloon sign had suddenly become very interesting. Silas looked like a man who wanted to disappear through the wooden planks beneath his boots. The back of his neck went red. "Clara," he started. "I mean it," Clara said without looking at her father. She was still watching Evelyn with those two serious eyes. "I've been waiting a long time." Evelyn's chest did something complicated. She had prepared for many things. She had practiced responses in her head during the long gray miles, responses to awkwardness, to disappointment, to the delicate early performance of two strangers trying to be civilized about a practical arrangement. She had prepared for disapproval. She had prepared for the possibility that he would look at her and immediately regret the letters. She had not prepared for a 7-year-old girl looking at her like she was the answer to a prayer. She crouched down, her knee protested, until she was level with Clara's face. "What's your name?" she asked, though she knew it. "Clara Rose Boone," the girl said with great seriousness. "But Papa only uses all 3 when I've done something wrong." "Clara, then." Evelyn studied her. The two serious eyes, the careful stillness, the particular bravery of a child who asked for things directly because she had learned that waiting didn't work. "I've had a very long trip," Evelyn said, "and I'm not at my best right now." "You look tired," Clara agreed. "I'm extremely tired, so I need you to know that I can't promise you anything today. Not today. Is that fair?" Clara considered this with the gravity of a small judge. "Are you going to leave?" she asked. The question hit differently than it should have. There was something in it. Not just a child's worry, but the specific fear of a child who had watched someone she loved disappear permanently and had since understood that people left, that staying was a choice, not a given. Evelyn held her gaze. "I didn't come 11 days through flood and mud," she said, "to leave." Clara looked at her for another long moment. Then she nodded once, the way her father nodded, like settling something. Silas cleared his throat. "We should get your trunk loaded." "The latch is broken," Evelyn said, standing. "I've tied it." "Henry can fix the latch," Silas said. Henry, still staring at the saloon sign, said nothing. "Henry!" Silas's voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. A long pause. Then Henry turned, walked past both of them without making eye contact, and picked up the trunk. He was strong for 10. Capable hands, practiced, used to work. He carried the trunk to the wagon parked on the side of the street without being told where it was, which meant he had known where to stand the whole time. He had just chosen to stand somewhere else. Evelyn watched him go. Silas watched her watch him. "He's not," he started. "He's fine," Evelyn said quietly. "He's allowed to be careful." Something crossed Silas's face then that she couldn't name. The ranch was 4 miles outside of Red Creek, and the ride there was conducted in the specific silence of people who have used up their social courage for the moment. Clara sat beside Evelyn in the wagon bed, close enough that their arms touched, and kept up a running description of everything they passed. That rock was where she'd found an arrowhead last summer. That stand of cottonwoods was where the creek flooded in spring. That fence line was the boundary between the Boone land and old Mr. Garrett's, who was mostly friendly but didn't like it if you went past the fence without asking. Evelyn listened and asked questions and let the girl fill the silence with things that needed to be said. Henry sat in the wagon bed on the opposite side, far enough away to make a point, and said nothing the entire 4 miles. Silas drove. Evelyn watched the land and tried to calibrate herself to it. It was a different kind of vast than she'd expected. She had grown up on the East Coast, where distance meant forests and valleys, where you were always enclosed by something. This land was flat and open in a way that felt less like freedom and more like exposure. Like the sky was looking at you directly, and you had nowhere to hide from whatever it decided to do. She didn't say this. She filed it away. The ranch house was made of timber and stone, 2 stories, well built but weathered. It sat in the middle of a yard that had work in progress everywhere. Fence sections leaning against the barn waiting to be rehung, a pile of split wood not yet stacked, a garden plot that had been dug out but not planted. It was the landscape of a man doing too many things alone, things that were getting done, but barely. Evelyn looked at all of it and did not make a sound. Silas helped her down from the wagon, brief, efficient, a hand under her arm for exactly as long as necessary, and then stepped back. "I'll show you the house," he said. "Please," she said. He showed her the kitchen first. She understood why. It was the room that would tell her the most about the job she'd agreed to, and he was practical enough to start there. It was large and cold and had a good iron stove and a work table that had clearly been scrubbed within the last week, which she thought was probably for her benefit. The pantry shelves were organized with the careful logic of a man who cooked because children needed to eat, not because he enjoyed it. Flour, salt, beans, dried corn, 3 jars of something preserved in the autumn. She picked one up and turned it to the window. "Peaches. Clara's favorites," Silas said behind her. "Who put them up?" "Margaret, my—" He stopped. "The children's mother. Last summer before she—" "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. She set the jar back carefully, in exactly the place she'd found it. He was quiet for a moment. "The bedroom for you is upstairs," he said. "First door on the right. Mine is at the end of the hall. Children are between." "All right. I want to be straightforward with you, Mrs. Hartwell." "Evelyn," she said, "please." He nodded once, like he was making a note of it. "Evelyn, I want to be straightforward. What I wrote in the letters, this is an arrangement, a practical one. I need someone to run this household and I can offer a home and security in return. I'm not looking for—" He paused again, choosing words carefully. "I'm not looking to complicate it beyond what it is." She looked at him. He was looking slightly past her, which she recognized as what a man did when he was saying something he needed to say but didn't fully want to. "I understood that from your letters," she said. I accepted those terms. Good, he exhaled. Good. Then we understand each other. We understand the arrangement, she said carefully, which was not quite the same thing, and they both heard the difference. He looked at her directly then, the first time she realized that he had looked at her face without immediately looking somewhere else. He had gray eyes, darker than she'd have expected, with the particular depth of someone who spent long hours outdoors in weather. There were lines around them that weren't from squinting at the sun alone. Supper's at 6, he said. You don't have to cook tonight if you're— I'll cook, Evelyn said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She kept her voice even. I'd like to. I'd like to do something useful before I fall asleep, so I feel like I earned the bed. Another almost smile, the same one from the street. All right, he said. There's chicken in the cold box. Clara can show you where things are. Clara showed her where everything was. She did this with great seriousness and a complete tour of every drawer, every shelf, every cabinet, including 2 that Evelyn wouldn't have needed for weeks, but which Clara felt were important to establish ownership of immediately. This one has the good spoons, Clara explained, pulling open a narrow drawer. Papa uses the regular spoons, but the good spoons are for when it matters. When does it matter? Evelyn asked. Clara thought about this. When company comes, or when someone is sick, or on Sundays. She paused. Or, she added, when someone new arrives. She looked up at Evelyn. Evelyn looked down at her. Bring me the good spoons, Evelyn said. Clara brought them. Maud. The kitchen filled slowly with the smell of something cooking, a simple chicken stew, because she'd found herbs in the pantry that someone had dried and forgotten, and she wasn't going to waste them. And Evelyn worked steadily through her exhaustion the way she had learned to work through most things, which was to simply not stop moving. Henry appeared in this kitchen doorway at some point, pretending to be looking for something on the shelf near the door. She didn't acknowledge him directly. She continued chopping carrots. After a long moment, he said from the shelf, She always put time in. Evelyn paused. Your mother? Silence. I'm putting time in, she said. She kept her voice neutral, not too soft, not too clinical, just even. If there's something she did a different way and you want to tell me, I'd rather know. Another silence, then, she cooked the onions first, before anything else, until they went brown. Evelyn looked down at her pot. The onions were in there, pale, mostly raw. She went to the fire and turned the heat differently under the pot, and she pushed the onions around until they started to go soft and translucent and beginning to brown at the edges, and the kitchen filled with a smell that was the specific smell of a particular kind of patience. She didn't look at Henry, but she heard him a moment later sit down at the kitchen table. He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. Supper was eaten mostly quietly. Clara talked enough for everyone. She had opinions about everything: the weather, the garden, the neighbor's dog, a crow that had been coming to the fence every morning for 3 weeks, which she had named Ferdinand and was certain had chosen them specifically. He's a crow, Henry said. He comes for the scraps. He likes us, Clara insisted. He likes the scraps. He could get scraps anywhere. He comes here. Henry looked at Evelyn across the table, with the automatic impulse of a child appealing to an adult for backup, and then caught himself, closed off, looked back at his plate. Evelyn ate her stew. It was decent. The onions were right. Silas ate methodically and said little. He refilled Clara's water without being asked, and cut a piece of bread before Henry could reach it, and passed it across the table without comment, and Evelyn watched these small, precise domestic movements, the practiced choreography of a man who had been running this table alone, and understood something about him that his letters hadn't conveyed. He was trying. Every day, in the small invisible ways that didn't make stories, he was trying. After supper he carried dishes to the basin, which surprised her. I'll wash, she said. I'll wash, she said again, not unkindly. He set the dishes down. He stood there for a moment like he wasn't sure what to do with the time he'd just been given back. I have fence work after dark, he said finally. Lantern work. Then go, she said. I have this. He went. Aight. She washed the dishes with Clara beside her, drying them with careful seriousness, placing each one back in exactly the right location because she had opinions about where things belonged, and Evelyn matched her. returned everything to the precise place she'd found it, not yet claiming any territory, not yet rearranging anything. That could wait. Henry had disappeared upstairs without a word. When Clara was tucked in, a process that involved 3 different opinions about which blanket went on top, 2 stories Evelyn didn't know, so she told one she did, a schoolroom story she'd used before, and finally a silence in which Clara simply lay looking at the ceiling until her eyes grew heavy. Evelyn went back downstairs and stood in the kitchen alone. The fire had died down. She added a log, watched it catch. Outside, somewhere in the dark, she could hear the distant sound of hammer on fence post, irregular, patient, working by lamplight in the cold. She stood at the window for a moment and looked at nothing. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, in the chair she hadn't taken at supper because it had been clearly Henry's, and she put her face in her hands, not crying. She didn't have enough left for that. Just stopping, just allowing herself 1 minute of not performing competence. She thought about Harlow, the quiet room, the neat, orderly life that had felt like a hallway she was walking through to get somewhere else, but which had never opened into any other room. She thought about the advertisement, not romance. She thought about Clara's face. Please be our mother. She thought about Henry's voice, flat and careful, and 8/10 shielded, but not quite all the way. She cooked the onions first. She thought about Silas saying she looked like someone who had survived a difficult road and meaning it, she had thought, as a kindness, not as an observation, as something he recognized. She lifted her face from her hands. The kitchen was quiet. The fire crackled. The hammer outside continued its irregular patience. This was real, she told herself. This was not Harlow. This was not the hallway. This was the room. It was messier than she had imagined, more complicated. There was grief here that hadn't finished moving through the walls. She could feel it the way you feel cold coming through a window before you see the crack. There were children here who needed things she didn't know yet how to give. There was a man somewhere in the dark doing fence work by lamplight because he hadn't stopped long enough since his wife died to let himself be still. And there was her, 34 years old, torn dress, broken trunk, mud on her second-best clothes, and the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet sitting quietly in the center of her chest. She got up. She found the flour. She didn't need to bake anything. There was bread. But she had always baked when she couldn't sleep, and she was not going to sleep tonight, and the kitchen was cold and needed warmth. She started measuring. Silas came in from the fence work sometime after 10. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She was at the work table with flour on her hands and a pan of biscuits going into the stove, and the kitchen was warm and smelled like something that hadn't been in it for a while. Not just bread, not just the fire, but something else, some quality of occupation that a kitchen needed a person in it to have. He stood there. She looked up. I couldn't sleep, she said. Matter of fact. No, he said. There will be biscuits in the morning. He nodded slowly. He was still in his coat, hat in his hands again. The mud on his boots was new from the yard. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been tired for a long time, so long that he didn't register it anymore as a state, but as a condition. The fence section on the east side, he said. It needs 2 people to set it right. I've been doing it alone and it keeps going crooked. She looked at him. I can hold a fence post, she said. He almost said something. Whatever it was, he changed his mind. Get some sleep, he said instead. First full day tomorrow. I know. He nodded again. He went to the stairs. Then he paused, half-turned, without looking at her directly. The stew was good, he said. She looked at the fire. The onions needed more time, she said. A beat. Next time, he said. He went upstairs. Evelyn stood in the warm kitchen with flour on her hands and listened to the sound of the house settling around her. The creak of the stairs, the sound of a door, the wind outside, and somewhere above her, the muffled sound of a small girl talking in her sleep. One unintelligible, urgent sentence, and then silence. She looked around the kitchen. The good spoons were in the drawer. The peach preserves were on the shelf. The fire was going. She was still tired. Her knees still ached. Her trunk was still broken, and her second-best dress was still muddy, and she had no idea. truly no idea what this life was going to look like in 6 weeks or 6 months or a year. But the biscuits were in the stove, and that was, for now, enough. The biscuits were gone by 7 in the morning, all of them, every last one. Clara had eaten 2 before Silas had come downstairs, and Silas had eaten 3 standing at the counter with his coat already on. And Henry had taken one from the pan without saying anything and eaten it in the doorway before walking out to the barn, and that, Evelyn decided, was the closest thing to a compliment she was going to get from him for a while. And she was going to take it. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the yard come to life in the early light. Silas moved between the barn and the fence line with the particular efficiency of a man who had arranged his mornings down to the minute because there were never enough of them. Henry appeared with the 2 older horses, walking them to water. Clara came out the back door in her coat, the wrong buttons done up, and ran toward the garden plot without explaining herself. Evelyn finished her coffee, then she went outside. The garden plot was about 30 feet from the back of the house, a rectangular patch of earth that had been turned over recently, maybe a week ago, the clods still rough and unbroken down to planting depth. Someone had driven 4 corner stakes and run a string line, which had since gone slack on one side. Good intention, incomplete follow-through. Clara was crouching at the edge of it, poking at the dirt with a stick. "What are you planting?" Evelyn asked. "We don't know yet," Clara said. "Papa turned it over, but then he got busy with the fence and we never decided." Evelyn looked at the plot. The soil was reasonable, dark, a little rocky, but workable. The orientation was good, south-facing, enough sun. "What did your mother plant?" Clara poked at the dirt. "Beans, squash, carrots." She paused. "She planted marigolds along the edge because she said they kept things away. I don't know what things." "Beetles mostly," Evelyn said. "Aphids. It works." Clara looked up. "Do you know about gardens?" "My mother kept one. I helped." She crouched down beside the girl and picked up a handful of soil, rubbing it between her fingers. It needed something. A little ash, maybe. She'd ask Silas what he had. "We should get seeds before the week is out, or we'll miss the window." Papa was going to do it. Then we'll remind him. Clara seemed to find this satisfying, right? Not that Evelyn was taking over, but that there was going to be a reminder, a plan, a next step. Children who had been living in organizational uncertainty, Evelyn had learned from years in a classroom, didn't need someone to do everything for them. They needed to know that someone was tracking the list. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. Her knee was stiff in the cold morning air, but manageable. "Come inside," she said. "You've got the wrong buttons." Clara looked down at her coat. "I know," she said. "I was in a hurry." "You were in a hurry to poke dirt with a stick." "Yes," Clara said, without any embarrassment at all. Evelyn almost laughed. It came out smaller than a laugh, just a breath, a loosening of something in her chest. But Clara caught it and smiled, wide and immediate, the way children smiled when they saw an adult be accidentally human. They went inside to fix the buttons. The first full day began like that, small, practical, unheroic. And it did not get particularly more dramatic as it went on, which was exactly how Evelyn had decided she was going to approach this. Not as a performance, not as a demonstration of her value, just as work, done steadily, in the direction of something. She inventoried the pantry properly after breakfast, with Clara helping and Henry occasionally drifting through the kitchen on errands that seemed designed to keep him in orbit without committing to proximity. She found that the salt supply was running low, that there was no vinegar, that someone had been using the good beeswax candles for everyday tasks, which was a waste, and that there were 2 crocks in the back corner that held something she couldn't identify. "Those are Papa's," Henry said from the doorway. "What's in them?" A pause. "I don't know. He never said." She left them exactly where they were. She made a list of what was needed from town. It was a long list, but she wrote it in order of urgency. Salt, vinegar, lamp oil, and then the seeds, and then a few things that could wait another week. She left it on the kitchen table folded in half, which was where she had noticed Silas tended to leave things he expected to find later. He came in for the midday meal and ate the soup she'd made from the leftover stew bones and whatever vegetables she'd found, and he looked at the list when he picked it up, and he read it through twice. "I can take this to town Thursday," he said. "The salt can't wait until Thursday." He looked at her. "The salt barrel is low," she said. "Not empty. But we're 3 days from empty. If something needs curing or preserving before Thursday, nothing should need curing before Thursday. Should isn't the same as won't." He looked at the list again. He set it back on the table. "I'll go tomorrow," he said. She nodded and went back to the stove. That evening she asked him about the ash, and he told her where the ash pile was from the winter burn, and she asked about fencing wire, and he explained what gauge they had left, and they talked for almost 40 minutes at the kitchen table about entirely practical matters, while Clara drew pictures at the other end of the table, and Henry did his lessons in the other room, and at no point did either of them acknowledge that 40 minutes of sustained conversation was already more than most practical arrangements produced in a week. It was easier to talk about things than about each other. Evelyn understood this. She had built whole years on exactly this principle. By the end of the first week, she had fixed the latch on her trunk herself, using a piece of hardware from the barn that she'd asked Silas about and he'd pointed her toward without comment. She had reorganized the supply shelves in the order she could work with them, moving things carefully and remembering where everything had been before. She wasn't claiming this kitchen, not yet. She was just making it functional. She had started the children on a lesson schedule for mornings, which Clara accepted with enthusiasm, and Henry accepted with the specific resignation of a boy who knew arguing would cost more than compliance. Henry was her most complicated problem. Not because he was difficult. He wasn't. Not exactly. He did what was asked. He didn't cause trouble. He was a good student when he engaged with the lessons, which he did about 60% of the time and spent the other 40% present in body, and somewhere else entirely in mind. He was careful around her. Not cold. Careful, which was different, and Evelyn recognized the difference because she had been the same way with people for most of her adult life. He was waiting to see if she'd stay. She understood this without him saying it. Children who'd lost a parent carried a particular kind of vigilance, a habit of emotional pre-protection, of not investing more than they could afford to lose. Henry had done the math on her and arrived at uncertain, reserved judgment. Do not engage more than necessary. She didn't push. She didn't try to win him. She just kept showing up. She showed up on a Thursday morning when she found him in the barn, struggling with a saddle repair that required 3 hands, and he only had 2. She didn't ask if he wanted help. She just took hold of the strap that needed to be held and held it, steady, until he had worked the buckle through. He said nothing. She said nothing. But she stayed and watched him finish the repair, and when he was done, she said, "Your stitching is good. Did someone teach you or did you work it out?" He looked at the saddle. "Papa showed me the basics. The rest I worked out." "The tension is even," she said. "That's not easy to teach. Most people pull too hard on one side." He put the saddle down. He still wouldn't look at her directly, always at something near her, something just to the side. "She used to say the same thing," he said quietly. Evelyn was still for a moment. "She was right," she said. She left him in the barn. The second week was harder than the first in ways she hadn't anticipated. The initial effort of arrival, the momentum of being new, of having to figure things out, faded, and what replaced it was the daily reality of the work, which was more than she'd calculated, even accounting for her calculations being generous. The house was big and had been running on minimal maintenance for months. Every room had something that needed attention beneath the surface. The window in the east bedroom let in cold air through a gap that had been stuffed with rags rather than repaired. The root cellar steps had gone soft on one side. The chicken coop had a section of wire that was one determined predator away from being a problem. She kept a second list. Things she noticed but hadn't been asked to fix. She brought them to Silas in pieces, not all at once, one thing at a time, after supper, when Clara was settled and Henry had gone to his room. "The east window in the far bedroom," she said one evening. "The seal's gone on the south edge. I found the rags." Silas set down his coffee cup. "I know about it. I know you know. I'm telling you I can stuff it properly if you have oakum or tow fiber. If you don't, tar would hold until spring." He was quiet for a moment. "I have oakum in the barn. Then I'll do it tomorrow if you show me where." He looked at his coffee cup. He did this sometimes, looked away when she said something that required him to respond to her as a person rather than as a function of the household. She had started to read it not as dismissal, but as the opposite, as someone buying himself a moment. You don't have to do the repairs, he said. That's not what I know what I was agreed to, she said. I'm choosing to do the repairs. Why? She looked at him directly. Because the window is cold and it's my room. He almost smiled again. The almost smile she was becoming familiar with. The one that lived just underneath the surface of his expression and occasionally made it partway to his face before he recalled some prior agreement with himself to be careful. Oakum's in the left side of the barn, he said. Top shelf. Thank you. She fixed the window the next morning. It took her longer than she'd estimated because the frame had warped slightly and the oakum needed to be packed in layers. But she worked steadily, and by midday the cold draft was gone and the room was noticeably warmer by evening. Silas noticed. She knew he noticed because he mentioned the temperature without mentioning the window, which was his way of noting something without making a production of it. That was the week she started to understand how he communicated, which was largely by means of omission and indirection, with occasional moments of startling directness that seemed to surprise him as much as her. He was not a man who talked about feelings because he had spent a long time treating feelings as obstacles to function, but he tracked things. He paid attention. He just mostly declined to announce it. She could work with that. She had been doing it herself for years. The trouble came at the end of the second week on a Friday afternoon when the weather turned. She had been out at the garden with Clara, who had appointed herself chief of the Marigold border and was taking the responsibility extremely seriously when the sky to the northwest went the color of an old bruise, greenish at the edges, heavy and low in the middle. Evelyn had grown up on the East Coast, but she had read enough about plains weather to recognize what that sky was suggesting. She got Clara inside in 4 minutes. She was looking for Henry when Silas came in from the south pasture at a run, not panicked, but moving with the focused speed of a man who had made a calculation and didn't like the result. "Where's Henry?" she said. "Should be in the barn." He was already moving past her. "Get Clara to the cellar." "I know where the cellar is. Lantern's on the hook by the door. I found it Tuesday." She was already turning. "Go." She got Clara to the cellar. The girl was frightened but holding it, keeping her fear small and manageable, the way children did when an adult around them stayed calm, which Evelyn was, outwardly, with some effort. She lit the lantern and got Clara settled on the old blanket chest they used as a seat and told her to count something. Anything. Just count. "Count what?" Clara said. "Nails," Evelyn said, pointing at a coffee tin on the shelf. "I want to know how many are in there." Clara pulled the tin over and started counting. Evelyn went back up the cellar stairs and looked at the sky. It had darkened considerably in the 6 minutes she'd been underground. The wind had picked up, running sideways and low, bending the grass flat. In the distance, she could see the barn, and she could see 2 figures moving between the barn and the house. Silas with Henry behind him, Henry's coat flapping in the wind. She went back down. She pulled the cellar door shut over her head. Darkness. The lantern. Clara's counting, rapid and earnest, punctuated by the muffled sound of the wind picking up above them. They were down there for 40 minutes. Silas came down 10 minutes after she'd shut the door, with Henry right behind, and the 4 of them sat in the underground dark while the storm moved through overhead. Not a tornado, as it turned out, just a severe line squall, the kind that sounded worse than it was, but could still do real damage if it caught something already weakened. They could hear it through the cellar door, the wind, something hitting the roof, rain that came down all at once like a dropped bucket. Clara had stopped counting nails. She had moved, at some point during the storm, until she was pressed against Evelyn's side, and Evelyn had put her arm around the girl without thinking about it, which was how it happened. Not as a decision, not as a gesture, but as just the automatic response of a body to a smaller body that needed something to hold on to. Henry sat across from them on an old crate. At some point during the louder part of the storm, he looked up and his eyes met Evelyn's in the lantern light. She couldn't read what was in his face exactly. Something complicated, something too old for 10 and not quite resolved into any particular emotion. She held his gaze for a moment. She didn't say anything. He looked away first, down at his hands. Silas sat near the stairs. He had his arms on his knees, and he was listening to the storm the way you listen to something you'd heard many times before, not without concern, but with a familiarity that kept the concern from becoming fear. At one point, the wind peaked and something large struck the exterior of the house, a branch probably from the cottonwood on the north side, and Clara made a sharp sound and gripped Evelyn tighter. Silas looked over at the sound. He looked at Clara pressed against Evelyn's side. He looked at Evelyn. She looked back. Neither of them said anything, but something passed between them in that look. Something that was honest precisely because they were underground in the dark with a storm going overhead, and there was no social energy to spend on being careful about it. Then he looked away, back at the stairs, listening. The storm passed in stages. The worst of it first, then a long diminishing, then just rain. Silas went up and checked after 20 minutes of quiet. He came back down and said the north cottonwood had lost a major branch across the yard, and the garden string line was down, but the barn was intact and the house roof looked all right from what he could see. They came up into the wet, storm-washed afternoon. The yard was scattered with leaves and small branches. The garden string line had come down exactly as he'd said, and 3 of Clara's marigold seedlings, she'd gotten them started in pots inside by the window, had blown off the sill and broken. Clara saw them when she went back inside. She stood in the kitchen looking at the 3 broken pots on the floor, the small green seedlings lying in the scattered dirt, and her face did the thing children's faces did before crying. Not the crying itself yet, but the stillness before it, the moment of absorbing something being gone. Evelyn came in behind her. She looked at the pots. "They're not dead," she said. Clara looked at her. "The roots are still intact on 2 of them. See the root ball? If we repot them tonight and water them carefully, they'll come back." She crouched down and picked up one of the seedlings, cradling the root ball in her palm. "This one's definitely all right. Come here." Clara came and crouched beside her. "Hold your hands like this," Evelyn said. Clara cupped her hands and Evelyn set the small seedling into them, root ball and all. "Now," Evelyn said, "don't squeeze, just hold." Clara held the seedling in her cupped hands with great concentration, and Evelyn found a pot and filled it with soil and told Clara when to place it in, and they repotted all 3. 1 too damaged to save, but 2 good ones, which Evelyn said honestly without softening it, because Clara was 7 and could handle that 1 seedling had been lost and 2 had not, and lying would not have helped. Henry, who had been in the doorway without either of them noticing, watched this from across the kitchen. That evening, Silas came in and found the kitchen warm and supper going, and the 2 surviving marigold seedlings on the windowsill, repotted and watered, and Clara telling Henry something about root structure with the confident authority of someone who had learned something important that afternoon. He stood in the doorway in his wet coat and looked at the kitchen for a moment. Evelyn was at the stove and didn't see him looking. He hung up his coat. He washed his hands. He sat down at the table and said, "What's for supper?" "Beans and salt pork," Evelyn said, "and biscuits." "Again with the biscuits," Henry said. "You ate 4 last time." "I was hungry." "You'll be hungry again." Henry almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Silas watched his son almost smile across the table at the woman standing at the stove, and he picked up his coffee cup, and he looked down at it, and he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Some things happened slowly and quietly, and the only way you knew they were happening was that you looked up one day and realized the shape of something had changed without you marking the exact moment it did. The kitchen felt different than it had 3 weeks ago. Not in any way you could point to in a single detail. Not because of the reorganized shelves or the fixed window or the marigolds on the sill. Something less tangible than any of those things. Something that had more to do with the particular quality of an evening where people were in the same room together and no one was performing anything. Just people. In a kitchen. At the end of a hard day. Evelyn served the beans. Clara talked about Ferdinand the Crow, who had returned to the fence that morning before the storm, and had looked directly at her, she was certain, directly at her, before flying off. Henry said, "He was looking at the scrap pile." "He was looking at me," Clara said. "You're not a scrap." "Thank you, Henry. That is very reassuring." Silas made a sound that was, unmistakably, a suppressed laugh. He covered it with his coffee cup. But Evelyn heard it, and when she sat down across from him, she didn't look at him directly. She looked at her plate. She was smiling. She didn't let it be a whole smile. Just enough. Just the shape of something that was starting, very slowly and without any fanfare, to feel like belonging. 3 weeks became a month and then 5 weeks. And somewhere in that span of time, the strangeness of the arrangement began to wear smooth at the edges. Not gone, not resolved, but less sharp, less likely to catch on something unexpectedly. Evelyn had stopped counting days. She hadn't noticed when it happened. One morning, she simply woke up without calculating how long she'd been there, and that absence of calculation told her something she hadn't been ready to examine directly. She was not a woman who stopped paying attention to exits. She had been paying attention to exits her entire adult life. The end of the school term, the end of a lease, the end of a marriage that had already ended before her husband's body agreed to follow. She was a woman who kept track of how long she'd been somewhere because she was always half aware of when she might have to leave. She was not doing that anymore. She noticed it like you noticed a sound that had stopped, by its absence. The garden was coming in. The bean seedlings had broken ground on a Tuesday, 10 days after planting, and Clara had discovered them and announced it with the intensity of a field general reporting a strategic victory. The squash was slower but promising. The marigolds, the two that had survived the storm, had been moved outside and were holding. The third pot, the one that hadn't made it, Clara had repurposed for a collection of interesting rocks, which Evelyn thought was a reasonable memorial. The morning routine had settled into something that worked. Evelyn was up first, fire going, coffee on by the time Silas came downstairs. He was not a man who talked before his first cup, and she was not a woman who needed him to. And this compatibility, this ability to occupy the same space in early morning silence without it being awkward, was something she had not expected and had come to value more than she'd have predicted. Henry had, gradually, and without announcement, started eating breakfast in the kitchen rather than taking his plate outside. He still didn't talk much, but he was there, and being there was itself a kind of statement, and Evelyn accepted it as such without making a thing of it. The lessons had become a genuine part of the mornings. Clara was quick, genuinely quick, the kind of quick that outpaced her age in reading and got tangled up only in arithmetic, where she tended to get impatient with the precision required. Henry was different. He was slower and more thorough, and he thought about problems in a sideways manner that sometimes led him to correct answers by routes Evelyn hadn't anticipated, which she found interesting enough that she'd started giving him harder problems just to see what he'd do with them. One morning, he solved a geometry problem she'd set for him by drawing the figure in the dirt on the floor, just a small square in the dust near his chair, working the proportions with his finger before writing anything on his slate. She saw it, but said nothing. Afterward, she added it to her list of things she knew about Henry Boone that she hadn't been given, that she'd simply observed. It was getting to be a long list. The problem, though, the thing she had been circling around without letting herself approach directly, was Silas. Not a problem exactly. Not in any way she could name cleanly, more like a persistent awareness. She was becoming more aware of him in the specific way that was inconvenient for a practical arrangement. The way she noticed the precise sound of his boots on the porch steps at the end of the day, and found herself locating it before she'd decided to listen for it. The way she had started tracking, without meaning to, where in the house he was at any given moment. The way his almost smiles had started mattering more than they should have, each one feeling like a door that opened 2 inches and then held. She had promised herself she wasn't going to let this happen, not because she was opposed to it in principle, but because she was realistic about the situation she'd walked into. A man still moving through grief, 2 children who needed stability more than they needed complications, and an arrangement built on the explicit understanding that this was not romance. This was not that. This was something practical and functional and safe. She had agreed to those terms. She had agreed to them because they had seemed in Pennsylvania like exactly what she wanted. She was beginning to suspect she'd been wrong about what she wanted. She kept this to herself. She was good at keeping things to herself. The complication arrived, as complications often did, from an unexpected direction. It was not a moment between her and Silas. It was a woman in town. They'd gone to Red Creek on a Thursday, Silas, Evelyn, and both children, for the monthly supply run. It was the most time they'd spent in public together, the 4 of them, and Evelyn was aware of how it looked from the outside even before they reached the main street. She was aware of eyes following the wagon. She had known there would be talk. There was always talk about arrangements like theirs and settlements like this, where everyone knew everyone else's history, and newcomers were evaluated with the particular scrutiny of communities that couldn't afford many mistakes. She had prepared herself for the evaluation. She hadn't prepared herself for Ruth Garfield. Ruth Garfield was a widow of about 50, sharp-faced and not unkind, who ran the dry goods store with her brother-in-law and who had clearly known Margaret Boone. Evelyn understood this the moment she walked through the door and saw Ruth's eyes travel from Evelyn to Silas to the children and back to Evelyn with an expression that was complicated enough to have several layers. It wasn't hostility. That might have been easier. It was grief, an assessment, and something protective all at once. Silas introduced Evelyn briefly, Mrs. Hartwell, who's been helping us run the ranch, which was accurate and also somehow more diminishing than she'd expected, though she couldn't immediately decide whether she was being unfair to be stung by it. She was helping run the ranch. That was what she was there for. That was the arrangement. Ruth was polite. She was careful. She helped Evelyn find the seed stock she needed and the vinegar and the lamp oil without incident. The incident happened when Silas had taken the children to the wagon and Evelyn was at the counter totaling the order. Ruth put her hand on the counter between them, not blocking, not aggressive, just there, and said, "You seem like a capable woman." "I try to be," Evelyn said. "Those are good children," Ruth said. "Henry's got his father's stubbornness. Clara's got her mother's heart." "I know," Evelyn said. Ruth looked at her for a moment. "Margaret was my friend for 11 years, she said. "I'm not saying that to make you uncomfortable. I'm saying it so you understand that when I ask you the next thing I'm going to ask, it's coming from care for that family and not from anything else." Evelyn set down her pencil. "All right. Are you staying?" The directness of it landed like a stone in still water. "That's my intention," Evelyn said. "Intention is different from staying," Ruth said. Not unkindly, flatly, the way a person stated a fact they'd learned the hard way. Evelyn held her gaze. "You're right. It is different." She paused. "I came a long way to be here. I'm not looking for a reason to leave." "Looking for one and finding one aren't the same thing either." "No," Evelyn agreed. "They're not." Ruth studied her for another moment. Then she picked up the pencil and finished tallying the order herself and wrote the number at the bottom and slid it across to Evelyn. "The boy," she said more quietly. "Henry. He took it very hard. When Margaret went, he doesn't." She stopped and looked out the window at the wagon, where Clara was talking to her father about something and Henry was sitting on the side with his arms around his knees. "He doesn't trust easy. If he trusts you, don't waste it." Evelyn looked at the number on the paper. "I know," she said quietly. She paid for the order and walked back out into the April sunlight and didn't let any of that show on her face, because the children were right there and Silas was right there, and this was not the moment for any of it. She packed the supplies into the wagon and helped Clara find a comfortable spot among the crates and said something normal, something about the garden, something to carry them through the drive home. But Ruth's voice stayed with her the whole 4 miles. "Are you staying?" She thought about it differently that night than she had in the cellar during the storm, or in the kitchen with the biscuits, or in any of the other moments where she'd felt the question move through her without fully forming. She had been thinking about it in terms of the arrangement, whether she was holding up her end, whether the household was running better, whether she was earning her place. Practical accounting. Ruth had asked it differently. Not are you performing your function, are you staying as a person, as a presence, as a thing that could be trusted? She sat up late that night in the kitchen. It had become her habit, this late sitting, this hour of stillness after the house went quiet. And she worked on mending because her hands needed something, and she thought better when her hands were busy. She was still sitting there when Silas came downstairs. He did this sometimes. She had started to understand that he didn't sleep well, and that when he couldn't sleep, he came down and checked the fire, and sometimes stood at the window and looked at the dark for a while. He did it without apparent self-consciousness, as though he'd been alone long enough that he'd forgotten to account for being observed. Tonight he stopped when he saw her. "You're up late," he said. "I know." He went to the stove and poured what was left of the coffee, which at this hour was barely warm. He sat down at the table, but not across from her. At the end, at an angle, the way men sat when they weren't committing to a conversation, but weren't leaving either. They were quiet for a while. "Ruth Garfield asked me if I was staying," Evelyn said. Silas wrapped his hands around the cup. He didn't say anything. She knew Margaret, Evelyn said. I know she did. She wasn't unkind about it. Ruth's not unkind, he said. She's honest. There's a difference. She cares about the children. A lot of people in Red Creek care about the children, Silas said. A lot of people in Red Creek have been waiting for me to... He stopped. He turned the cup in his hands. Make a mess of this, he finished. Evelyn put down her mending. Is that what they think is happening? Some of them. He shrugged, which was not quite a dismissal. Some of them think I moved too fast. Some of them think I should have waited longer before... He paused again. These pauses were not evasions she had come to understand. They were genuine stops, places where the words had to be found, before bringing someone in. And what do you think? She asked. He looked at his coffee cup. I think the children needed someone, he said. I think Henry had been running the kitchen in the mornings before I got up. I think Clara had been going to bed some nights without anyone. His voice caught on something, and he stopped and pressed through it, without anyone checking on her. I think I was keeping the ranch alive and letting the house die around us. He set the cup down. I think I needed to do something different. That's not what I asked, Evelyn said. He looked at her then, direct, the way he was only occasionally. No, he said, it's not. The fire shifted in the stove. Outside the window, the night was clear and cold, the sky enormous the way it always was out here. So many stars it looked impractical. What did you imagine, Evelyn asked carefully, when you were writing the letters before I arrived? What did you think it would be? Silas was quiet for a long moment. Practical, he said. I thought it would be practical. Someone who could run the house, someone the children could rely on, someone who... He exhaled. I thought there'd be a clearer line between the arrangement and... He stopped. And what's outside the arrangement? She finished. Yes. She looked at the mending in her hands. The shirt she was repairing was Henry's, a tear in the elbow that he'd probably got from the fence, though he hadn't said. She had simply found it and picked it up and started working on it without making it an event. The woman in the letters, Silas said, and his voice was different now, quieter. The one who wrote about being reliable and patient. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table. I read those letters, and I thought I understood what I was asking for. What kind of person would come out here for a thing like this? Evelyn waited. You're not... He stopped himself. I'm not what? You're not what I expected, he said. And then, because apparently this night had decided to be honest, he added, You're more than what I expected, and I'm not sure what to do with that. The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn felt something move in her chest. Not a simple thing, not a clean thing. Something with weight to it. She had been carrying it for several weeks and pretending it was lighter than it was. I'm not sure what to do with it either, she said. He looked up. She met his eyes and did not look away. I came here because it seemed safe. No romance, no expectations, just something real and functional. I thought that was what I needed. She stopped, looked down at the mending. After the marriage I had. After Harlow. I thought I was done with wanting things that could hurt me. And now? He asked. She looked back up at him. Now I fix your son's shirts, she said. And I know how your daughter takes her coffee. Yes, she's 7 and takes coffee. I told her it was mostly milk, and she was satisfied. And I know that you check the east fence line first every morning because you're worried about the weak post. And I know that when you almost smile, it means you found something funny and won't let yourself have it yet. And She stopped because her voice had done something unexpected and she needed a moment. He was watching her with the full attention he usually distributed more carefully. I don't know when this stopped feeling like an arrangement to me, she said. I should probably be more careful about that. Probably, he said. Neither of them moved. You lost someone, she said. I know that. I'm not asking you to... She stopped and took a breath and tried again. I'm not standing here telling you this because I expect anything in return. I'm telling you because Ruth Garfield asked me if I was staying, and it made me realize I'd already answered that question for myself. I'm staying, not because it's the arrangement, because I want to, and you should know that. Silas looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual. Margaret's been gone 14 months, he said. For the first 8 of those months, I wasn't. He shook his head. I was a bad father for 8 months. I was here in the body and nowhere else. Henry kept things running. A 10-year-old kept things running. Because I couldn't. He looked at the table. I carry that. That's not... I know it's not the worst thing a man has done, he said, cutting her off gently. I know that. But it's what happened, and I don't pretend otherwise. He was quiet. I wrote the letters because I had to do something different. I put up the advertisement, and I wrote the letters, and when yours came back, I thought... He paused. I thought you sounded like someone who'd been through something too. Someone who wasn't going to require things I didn't have to give. I wasn't, she said. I'm not. I know. His jaw moved. That's the part I didn't account for. What part? He looked at her. That the not requiring would start to feel like its own kind of problem. That I'd start to... He stopped again. The stops were getting harder for him. She could see it. He was a man who had not talked about himself in a long time, and the mechanism was rusty. That I'd start to notice you, he said finally, in a way that goes past what the arrangement covers. The fire ticked in the stove. Evelyn set down the shirt. Silas, she said, I need you to understand something. I'm not Margaret. I'm not going to be Margaret. I'm not trying to be, and you shouldn't want me to be, for either of our sakes. I know that, he said, and he said it like he meant it. And I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. She looked at him steadily. I just think we've both been working very hard to pretend this is simpler than it is. And I'm tired, she said, and there was a particular weight to that word, tired, that had nothing to do with the hour. I'm tired of pretending. He held her gaze. Then he reached across the table. He didn't take her hand. He just set his hand on the table, palm up, open, not asking for anything, just there. Like the way he'd held his hat on the street that first day, that strange small gesture she'd thought about more than once since. She looked at his hand. She placed hers in it. Neither of them spoke. They sat like that for several minutes, in the warm kitchen, with the fire going and the stars outside and the house quiet around them. And it was not dramatic, and it was not a resolution, and it was not a decision about anything in particular. It was just two people who had both been through something that had left them with less than they started, sitting in the same room and admitting, for the first time, that they were in the same room. That was enough for that night. That was more than enough. It was Henry who broke it, though he didn't mean to, or maybe he did, in the way of children who sense things and intervene before they fully understand what they're intervening in. He appeared at the bottom of the stairs in his socks, and an expression of studied casualness that didn't fool either of them. I can't sleep, he said. Evelyn withdrew her hand. Silas straightened. There's milk warming on the stove, Evelyn said, as if she'd known he was coming, as if this was a perfectly ordinary thing. Henry looked at the stove, then at her, then at his father, then back at the stove. He went and poured himself milk. He sat down at the table. He didn't say anything else, and neither did they. And the three of them sat in the kitchen in the late-night quiet until Henry's eyes started to go heavy, and then Silas stood up and put a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, Come on, back to bed. Henry got up. He was half asleep already, moving on the specific autopilot of children who fought too hard against sleep and then lost all at once. Silas steered him toward the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, Henry stopped. He looked back at Evelyn. His eyes were heavy and his hair was disheveled, and in that particular half-asleep state he was less guarded than Evelyn had ever seen him, the armor of his waking hours set aside without him noticing. The milk was good, he said, quietly, as if it were a small confidence. It's the same milk as always, Evelyn said. I know, Henry said. It's still good. He went upstairs. Silas stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment after the boy had gone, his hand on the newel post. He didn't look at Evelyn. He looked at the stairs. He hasn't, Silas started. He stopped. He tried again. He doesn't say things like that, not to... He stopped again. I know, Evelyn said gently. Don't make it a big thing, he said. I'm not. I mean, don't treat him differently because of it. He'll close back up if he thinks you noticed. I know that too, she said. He finally looked at her. Something in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not the almost smile, not the careful distance. Something more exposed than either of those things. Something that looked like it was taking the risk of being seen. "Good night, Evelyn," he said. "Good night, Silas," she said. He went upstairs. She stayed in the kitchen for a while after. She picked up the mending. She worked on Henry's shirt in the firelight, the stitch careful and even, the way she did everything when she wanted to make it last. Outside, the frontier night was wide and cold and indifferent, and somewhere in it a coyote called once and then was quiet, and the cottonwood on the north side moved in the wind, the one that had lost its branch in the storm and grown around the loss the way trees did, continuing regardless. Evelyn kept her eyes on the stitching, and the thought that sat in the center of her chest was not a comfortable thought, not a simple one, but it was the truest one she'd had in years. She was in the right place. She didn't know yet what that meant. She didn't know what it was going to cost her, or what it was going to give her, or how far she'd have to go before the shape of it became clear. She knew that there was a man upstairs who carried grief like a stone in his pocket and had just, briefly, set it down. She knew there were two children who were, in their separate ways, beginning to trust her with things that mattered. She knew the garden was coming in, and the east fence post was still weak, and the salt supply would need restocking again by the end of the month. She knew she was staying. That was enough. She finished the shirt, she folded it. She set it on the chair where Henry would find it in the morning, and she banked the fire, and she went upstairs to the room that was beginning, quietly and without ceremony, to feel like hers. The shirt was gone from the chair before Evelyn came downstairs. She noticed its absence the way she'd learned to track small things in this house, quietly, without making it mean more than it did yet. Henry had taken it. That was all. Whether he'd noticed the repair, whether he'd understood who had done it, whether it had landed anywhere in him, that was not something she could know this morning. And she had learned by now that pressing for evidence of progress with Henry Boone was the surest way to make it retreat. She made coffee. She started breakfast. The morning moved through its familiar shapes. What changed in the days after the late-night kitchen conversation was not dramatic. There was no declaration, no renegotiation of terms, no moment where either of them acknowledged out loud that something had shifted. But things were different in the way that a room was different after furniture had been moved. The same walls, the same light, but the space arranged differently, and you kept almost running into where things used to be. Silas talked more. Not extensively. He was still a man who treated words like a finite resource, but more than before, and about different things. He started telling her things about the ranch that weren't requests or practical information. One evening, he explained the history of the East Pasture, how his father had broken that ground the year Silas was born, how the soil there was different from the west side, rockier but better for certain grasses. He told her this while they were mending fence together. She'd started coming out to help with the two-person sections, because it was faster and because she'd said she could hold a fence post and she'd meant it. She didn't make a thing of the talking. She just listened and asked the occasional question and let him find the pace that was comfortable. She had learned that with Silas you did not rush the river. You worked alongside it and let it find its own way. Henry found the mended shirt 2 days after she'd left it on the chair. Or rather, she assumed he'd found it the morning after. But 2 days later, he appeared in the barn doorway while she was with the horses and said, without preamble, "The stitching on the elbow. It's better than before." Evelyn ran a brush down the mare's flank. "The original seam was off grain," she said. "It would have torn again in the same place." Henry leaned against the doorframe. "How do you know how to do that?" "My mother taught me. She was particular about mending." He was quiet for a moment. "Most mending just holds," he said. "It doesn't usually—" He seemed to be looking for the word. "Match." Evelyn looked over at him. "You noticed." "The thread's the same color," he said, slightly defensive about having paid attention. "I asked your father where the thread was kept." Henry processed this, the fact that she'd gone looking specifically for the right thread, that it had been a choice, not a convenience. "He showed you where the sewing box was?" he said. "He showed me the whole barn," she said. "I asked for a tour the second week. I wanted to know where things were." Henry was quiet again. Then, "He doesn't usually show people the barn." "I know," she said. "I asked anyway." She went back to the brushing. She could feel him still standing in the doorway, turning something over. "Miss Evelyn," he said. She paused. He had never used her name before, not directly, not to address her. He'd been managing without it for 6 weeks, which was its own kind of skill. "Henry," she said, "do you know how long you're staying?" She set down the brush and turned to face him properly. He was standing in the frame of the barn door with the morning light behind him, and his arms crossed in the posture he used when he was trying to be older than he was, trying to hold something at a manageable distance. "Yes," she said. "How long?" "As long as you'll have me," she said. The words came out more plainly than she'd planned, more direct, but she didn't walk them back. He had asked her a straight question, and she had a straight answer, and he was 10 years old and had already had enough people in his life be careful with words to the point of uselessness. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved once, the Boone jaw, the same motion she'd seen in his father 100 times. "Okay," he said. He pushed off the doorframe and walked back toward the house. Evelyn turned back to the mare. The mare turned her head and looked at her with one large, profoundly unbothered eye. "Don't," Evelyn said. She picked up the brush and kept working. The difficulty arrived as most real difficulties did, not from outside but from inside the house. It arrived on a Sunday evening in the 6th week, and it arrived in the form of a question Evelyn was not prepared for, from the person she least expected to ask it. They had eaten supper, a decent supper, roast chicken that had come out well because she'd figured out the particular temperament of the stove, which ran hot on the right side and needed compensating for. The dishes were done. Clara was drawing at the table. Henry was reading the geography book she'd found in the trunk in the spare room. Silas had gone to the porch for the last of the daylight, which was a habit of his, those 10 minutes at the end of the day before the dark came all the way down. Evelyn was putting away the last of the dried dishes when Clara, without looking up from her drawing, said, "Are you and Papa going to stay married?" Evelyn set the plate down carefully. "We are married," she said, keeping her voice even. "I know," Clara said. "I mean like a real one." Evelyn turned around. Clara was still looking at her drawing, a picture that appeared to involve Ferdinand the Crow in some kind of elaborate scenario with the garden, and her expression was entirely serious, and also, clearly, the expression of a child who had been sitting with this question for some time before deciding to release it. "What does a real one look like to you?" Evelyn asked. Clara put down her pencil. She folded her hands on the table in the way she did when she was about to say something that required its full gravity. "When Mama and Papa were married," she said, "Papa used to come find her at the end of the day. Not for any reason, just to be near her." She paused. "He doesn't do that." Evelyn sat down across from her. "People are different," she said carefully. "I know." Clara looked at her with those eyes that were too serious and too perceptive for 7. "But you want him to," she said. "And he almost does. I can see the almost." Evelyn was quiet. "I'm not saying it's bad," Clara added, with the quick reassurance of a child who understood social consequence better than she should have had to. "I'm saying I notice." "You notice a lot," Evelyn said. "Mama said the same thing," Clara said. She said it plainly, without performance, just as a fact. "She said I had too many eyes." A pause. "I don't think you can have too many eyes." "I don't think so either," Evelyn said quietly. Clara picked up her pencil again. "I want it to be a real one," she said. "In case you didn't know. I want you to stay, and I want it to be real, and I want Papa to stop looking at the door at the end of the day, like he's waiting for someone who isn't going to come." She began drawing again. "That's all." Evelyn sat at the table for another minute after Clara returned to her drawing, as if the chair had become load-bearing. She got up, she put on her coat, she went to the porch. Silas was at the rail, looking west, the last of the light going orange at the horizon and then fading. He heard her come out but didn't turn. She stood beside him at the rail. "Clara asked me if ours was a real marriage," she said. A pause. "What did you tell her?" "I told her people were different." She looked at the horizon. "She told me that wasn't what she'd asked." "She's 7, he said. "She's sharp," Evelyn said. "She sees the almost." Silas was quiet for a moment. "The almost." Her word. He put his hands on the rail. He looked at them. "I don't know how to—" he started and then stopped and then started differently. I think about Margaret every day. I think about her every day, and I don't know if that's going to stop or if it gets quieter or if... He exhaled. I don't have an answer to that, and it seems unfair to... I'm not asking you to stop thinking about her, Evelyn said. I know you're not asking. I mean it, Silas. She turned to look at him, and he turned to look at her, and they were very close in the narrow porch space, closer than the kitchen table or the fence line. She was here for 11 years. She's the mother of your children. I'm not in competition with a ghost. I wouldn't win, and I wouldn't want to. She held his gaze. But I am here, right now, and I'm not a ghost. He looked at her. The last of the light was doing something to the sky behind her that made the whole world feel suspended, and she thought, watching his face, that he was doing the same thing he always did. The stop, the search for words, but that this time what he was looking for was not words. He raised his hand and very briefly, very carefully, tucked a strand of hair back from her face that the wind had pulled loose. His hand was rough from the fencework and cold from the evening air, and the gesture was small and imperfect, and it lasted about 2 seconds, and it was the most honest thing she had felt in years. I know you're not a ghost, he said. She didn't say anything. I've been... He stopped. Scared, he said, as if the word cost him something, which it clearly did. Of doing this wrong. Of giving the children something and then losing it. Of... He stopped again. I lost a person, he said. I know what that does to children. I know what it did to Henry, and I thought, if I didn't make this more than it had to be, then there was less to lose. There's always something to lose, she said. Yes. He looked at her. I'm starting to understand that keeping the distance doesn't make the loss smaller. It just makes the... He struggled. The time before the loss smaller, and that seems like a bad trade. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. It's a terrible trade, she said. Something in his face released. Not all at once. Not completely. Silas Boone was not a man who released things all at once, but enough. Enough that she could see what was underneath the careful, practical, closed-off surface he had worn for 14 months. And what was underneath it was not frightening. It was just a person, tired and trying and full of things he hadn't had anywhere to put. I don't want an arrangement, he said. His voice was low. I've been pretending I did because it seemed safer, but I don't. He looked at her steadily. I want what Clara said, the real one. Evelyn breathed. So do I, she said. I have for a while. I know, he said. I could tell. And you waited anyway. I'm slow, he said, and there was the almost smile, and this time it finished. Came all the way to his face, unheld, unguarded, and it changed him, made him look younger and more tired and more alive all at once, and Evelyn felt something in her chest unlock like a door that had been stuck for years, and she had stopped checking. She laughed. Not a small laugh this time, not a breath, a real one, short and surprised, and he heard it, and the smile didn't go away. You are slow, she said. I know. They stood at the rail together in the dark that had finished coming down while they were talking, and she put her hand over his on the rail, and he turned his over and held it, and this time neither of them moved for a long time. The next morning they told the children at breakfast. Evelyn had stayed up too late and was on her second coffee before 8. Silas had come downstairs at his usual time, looked at her across the kitchen, and said nothing. But there had been something different in the looking. The way a room was different when the furniture was finally, properly arranged. Clara was working through her biscuit with great seriousness. Henry was at the table with his geography book, pretending to read and clearly listening. Silas sat down. He looked at his children. He said, I want to talk to you both about something. Henry put the book down. Clara looked up. Mrs. Hartwell and I... He stopped. He started again. Evelyn and I have been talking about what kind of family we're going to be. He looked at them both steadily, the way he delivered anything important, directly, without softening it past recognition. And we want to be a real one, not just a household, a family, if that's all right with both of you. The table was quiet. Clara's face went through approximately 6 expressions in 4 seconds. Then her eyes filled up, which she clearly had not anticipated because she looked briefly startled by her own reaction, and then she gave up on being composed about it and the tears came down, and she said, "I already told you yes," to Evelyn, as if this decision had been made weeks ago and everyone was only now catching up. "I know," Evelyn said. "We needed to be sure." Henry was looking at the table. His hands were flat on either side of his book. "Henry," Silas said. "I know," Henry said. Quiet, not looking up. "I already knew." Silas looked at him. "What do you mean, you already knew?" Henry looked up then. His expression was complicated in the specific way of a 10-year-old who has been carrying adult-sized understanding in a child's frame. "The shirts," he said. He looked at Evelyn. "You looked for the right thread. You didn't have to do that." He looked back at his father. "And you showed her the barn." His jaw moved once. "You don't show people the barn?" Silas opened his mouth and then closed it. "I know what it means when you show someone the barn," Henry said, with absolute seriousness. Clara had stopped crying and was watching her brother with an expression of profound admiration. "When did you figure that out?" Silas asked. "A while ago," Henry said. He looked at Evelyn again. His eyes were still cautious, still measuring, still the eyes of a boy who had learned that staying was a choice, not a given. But underneath the caution was something that was working its way toward the surface, slow and careful, the way the bean seedlings had broken through the soil, inevitable, once started, but on their own time. "Are you all right with it?" Evelyn asked him, directly, not talking around it. He held her gaze. "The shirts," he said again. It was not an answer that explained itself easily, but she understood it exactly. The thread matched. She'd gone looking for the right one. You didn't do that for an arrangement, you did that for something else entirely. "Yes," she said. "The shirts." Henry nodded once. Then he picked up his geography book and opened it and said, "What's for supper?" "It's 8 in the morning," Silas said. "I'm planning ahead." Clara laughed, sudden and bright, the laugh of a child who had been waiting for permission to be happy and had just received it. The sound of it filled the kitchen and bounced off the walls and settled into the corners like light. And Silas looked across the table at Evelyn and did not look away, and Evelyn looked back and did not look away either, and the breakfast got cold while nobody thought to eat it. The breakfast did eventually get eaten, cold biscuits and all, and nobody complained. That was the thing about the Boone household that Evelyn had come to understand. It was not a place where people made a production of feelings. They were felt, sometimes deeply, sometimes messily, but they were not performed. Clara was the closest thing to theatrical, and even she, after her tears at breakfast, simply wiped her face with her sleeve and asked if she could plant more marigolds on the west side of the garden, and the conversation moved on the way. Real family conversations moved on, not because the moment hadn't mattered, but because there were things to do and the moment had already done its work. Evelyn thought about this afterward, about how she had spent years in Harlow among people who announced their feelings like they were posting notices, formal, loud, requiring a response. She had never quite fit that. She had always been better at the quiet kind of caring, the kind that showed up in thread colors and warm milk, and knowing which window let in cold air. She had thought for a long time that this meant something was missing in her, that she was not built for the larger expressions. Standing in the kitchen of the Boone Ranch, watching Silas refill his coffee and Henry argue gently with Clara about the West Side marigolds and whether Ferdinand the Crow would appreciate them or consider them an imposition on his fence territory, she understood that nothing had been missing. She had just been in the wrong place for it. Summer came to Red Creek the way it always did out on the frontier at Chimalcoan, fast and without much warning, the temperature jumping 2 weeks ahead of what the calendar suggested. The garden that had been tentative in April was aggressive by June. The bean rows went tall. The squash spread in every direction with the cheerful expansionism of a plant that had decided the whole yard was negotiable. The marigolds, both east and west side now, blazed orange along the borders with a stubbornness that Evelyn found personally satisfying. The work of the ranch intensified with the season, the way ranch work did, and Evelyn moved through it with the practicality she'd always had, and a new physical competence she was building week by week. Her hands had changed, harder, differently callous than the chalk and ink calluses of the schoolroom. Her left knee had either strengthened or simply given up protesting. She could set a fence post now with reasonable efficiency, read weather out of the northwest sky, and identify which of the 3 horses was going to be difficult on any given morning just by the way it stood in the paddock. She taught Henry to read weather, too. Not formally. She did not make it a lesson, because he would have resisted it on principle. She just started saying things out loud when they were working outside together, small observations, the way the wind was moving across the grass, what it meant when the clouds stacked in a particular formation over the mountains. He listened without appearing to listen. Then one afternoon he said, before she did, "Rain by evening, coming from the northwest." He said it flat, no inflection, the way he said most things. "Yes," she said. He went back to what he was doing. She went back to what she was doing. That was the lesson. Silas noticed the change in Henry before he said anything about it, which was his way. He mentioned it one evening, quietly, after the children were asleep. They had taken to talking after the children were asleep, not always about anything important, sometimes just the accounting of the day, but it had become a time they both moved toward without discussing it. He said, "He's different since you came." Then, because Silas always felt the need to be precise, better. Not different, better. "He was already good," Evelyn said. "He just needed someone to stay long enough to see it." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I saw it. I know you did, but you were managing everything alone and grief takes up space. He needed another pair of eyes." She paused. "He needed to feel like he wasn't responsible for holding everything together anymore." Silas set down his cup. He looked at it. This was the conversation they'd been moving toward for weeks, she knew, the one about those 8 months when he'd said Henry had kept things running. He had mentioned it once, briefly, in the late-night kitchen, and carried it since. "I think about that," he said, "what he took on when he shouldn't have had to." "He knows you were grieving," Evelyn said. "He's 10, not 40, but he understands more than he lets on." "That doesn't make it—" "No," she said, "it doesn't make it right. But it happened, and he's not broken by it, and that's worth something." She looked at him directly. "Have you told him that you know what he did? That you're sorry he had to?" Silas didn't answer immediately. "Silas, I don't know how to start that conversation," he said. "You start it by starting it," she said. "He doesn't need a speech. He needs to hear that you know." He nodded slowly. It was the nod of a man making a decision he'd been putting off. He had the conversation with Henry the next morning out at the barn, just the two of them. Evelyn stayed in the kitchen and didn't ask what was said afterward. She watched them come back to the house together, walking side by side in that particular Boone way, both looking straight ahead, both with the same set to their shoulders. At the door, Henry stopped and said something to his father, short, and Silas put his hand briefly on the back of the boy's neck and Henry let him, and then they came inside and nothing about it was mentioned at breakfast. But Henry sat closer to his father at the table than he had before. Just slightly. Just enough. Some things didn't need narrating. Ruth Garfield saw Evelyn at the dry goods store in July and looked at her for a long moment before saying, "You look different." "I've been working outside, Ink," Evelyn said. "Not that kind of different," Ruth said. She seemed to decide something. "The boy came in last week with his father. He introduced you to the Ketterman family." She paused. "He said, 'This is Evelyn. She lives with us.'" Evelyn stopped what she was looking at. "Henry said that?" "Henry Boone said, 'She lives with us,'" Ruth confirmed. "Not 'she's helping' and not 'she's our housekeeper.' She lives with us." Ruth looked at her with the measuring, honest eyes of a woman who had asked her once if she was staying. "I thought you should know." Evelyn looked at the shelf in front of her. She wasn't seeing what was on it. "Thank you," she said. Ruth made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal and went back to her work. Evelyn stood in the dry goods store in Red Creek, Colorado, in July, with sun coming through the window and dust in the air, and she breathed through the thing in her chest that was too full to name, and then she picked up the vinegar she'd come for and went to the counter. The summer moved forward. The squash was harvested. The beans were put up. Evelyn learned to use Margaret's old preserving crocks, the ones she'd left in the corner, because Clara asked her to one afternoon, simply and directly, the way Clara asked for everything. "Mama used to put up the beans in those," she said, pointing. "I want to learn how." They put up the beans together. It took 2 full days, and Clara dropped one crock, and it didn't break, but the lid cracked. And she cried briefly. And then they found a different lid and kept going. The finished crocks went on the cellar shelf beside the peach preserves from last autumn. Margaret's peaches, Evelyn's beans, side by side on the same shelf. Evelyn looked at the shelf when they were done. She thought about what Ruth had said, about 11 years of friendship, about a woman she had never met whose children she was raising and whose kitchen she was learning and whose peach preserves she had always put back in exactly the same place because it seemed important not to displace them. She didn't think she was replacing Margaret Boone. She had been clear on that from the late-night conversation with Silas. But she thought about what it meant to come after someone, not to erase them, but to continue the life they had been part of, to be the next person standing in the kitchen, to teach Clara what Margaret would have taught her if she'd had more time. There was something in that which felt not like competition, but like responsibility, like picking up a thread and keeping it going. She hoped she was doing it right. She didn't always know if she was. That uncertainty, she had come to understand, was not a problem to be solved. It was just part of what it meant to love imperfect people imperfectly in an imperfect place. Autumn arrived, and with it a conversation in Red Creek that Evelyn heard about secondhand through the particular telegraph of frontier gossip. Mrs. Ketterman had told the Halsey woman, who had mentioned it to Silas at the feed store, that it was something to see what had become of the Boone place. How you could hear the children from the road some evenings, laughing at something. How the garden had produced better than any year she could remember. How Silas had looked, at the end of summer, like a man who had put down something heavy he had been carrying for a very long time. Silas told Evelyn this in the way he told her most things, briefly, without emphasis, watching her face while he said it to see what it meant to her. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said the garden was a good year," he said. She looked at him, and, he added, that the rest was accurate. She laughed, the full laugh, the real one. He watched her laugh with the expression he'd been wearing more often lately, the one where the almost smile had become just a smile, unheld and unguarded, where he let himself be pleased without negotiating with himself about it first. "You're still slow," she said. "I know," he said. "You keep telling me." "I'll probably keep telling you." "I expect so." There was, at the end of October, a difficulty. There was always a difficulty, and anyone who told a story about family without one was leaving out the part that made the story true. It was Henry. He had been doing well, measurably, genuinely better, less guarded, more present, more willing to be a child rather than a small foreman. But October brought something Evelyn hadn't anticipated, the anniversary of Margaret's death. She had died in late October the previous year, and as the month progressed, Henry grew quieter in a different way than his usual quiet. This was not the watchful reserve she'd learned to read. This was something that closed inward. He stopped doing the lessons. He stopped eating full meals. He disappeared to the barn for hours and came back with nothing to show for it. Not work done, just time spent somewhere away from people. Silas noticed and said nothing because he was doing his own version of the same thing. Quieter at meals, more hours at the fence line, coming to bed later. The anniversary moved through the house like weather, and Evelyn let it because some weather you didn't argue with. She did not try to fix it. She did not produce meals designed to cheer or lessons designed to distract or conversation designed to pull them back into the world before they were ready. She kept the fire going. She kept the kitchen warm. She cooked the things she'd learned they liked, without comment, without expectation. She let the house be quiet when it needed to be quiet. One evening, toward the end of October, she was sitting in the kitchen when Henry came downstairs at an hour that was too late for him and stood in the doorway looking like he'd been crying and wasn't going to say so. She did not say she could see he'd been crying. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. She put warm milk in front of him. Not coffee, not tea. The same warm milk from the first storm, from the first night he'd appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He wrapped his hands around the cup. They sat in silence for a while. "She would have liked the garden," he said finally. "What makes you say that?" "She liked things that grew." He looked at the cup. "She had this. She used to grow herbs on the windowsill, all winter. Even when everything outside was dead, she had these little pots." He stopped. "We didn't plant any this year." Evelyn looked at the window. "There's still time before the hard frost," she said carefully. "If we start cuttings now, we could get them going inside." Henry looked up. "What kind of herbs did she grow?" Evelyn asked. He thought. "Rosemary, mint, something she called lemon balm." A pause. "I don't know where she got the seeds." "I have lemon balm seed in my trunk." Evelyn said. "I brought it from Pennsylvania." Henry looked at her. "My mother grew it," Evelyn said. "I brought some when I came." She held his gaze. "We could start it this week. It would be in the window by December." His jaw moved. "Yeah," he said. It came out rough. Okay. They started the cuttings the next morning, and Silas came in at midday and found Henry and Evelyn at the kitchen window with small pots and soil. Henry explaining to Clara with great seriousness that lemon balm smelled a certain way and she should smell it, and Clara smelling the dried leaf and making an extravagant face, and Evelyn saying, "It gets better when it's fresh," and Henry saying, "It was always good," with a loyalty to the plant that was about something more than the plant. Silas stood in the doorway. His eyes went to Henry's face, then to Evelyn's, then to the small pots on the windowsill. He understood. He sat down at the table and said, "Show me which one is the lemon balm." And Henry, who had not offered his father much of anything easily in the past year, pushed one of the small pots across the table toward him. The rest of autumn moved through its changes. The lemon balm took. The rosemary was slower but established itself by November. The house smelled, by the time the first snow came, like herbs and firewood and bread, and something else underneath all of those things, something harder to name, a quality of occupation that wasn't just people living in a house, but people living in it together, choosing it daily, making it theirs. Clara had stopped asking if Evelyn was going to leave. She had stopped asking because she had moved on to other questions, more immediate, more practical. Could they get a second cat? Would Evelyn teach her the stitch she used on Henry's shirts? Was it possible to train Ferdinand the Crow to deliver small messages between the ranch and town? The question of Evelyn's permanence had been settled in Clara's mind and filed away, and she had moved on, which was the most children could offer in the way of trust, and which was everything. The blue dress was in the trunk in Evelyn's room. She had washed it twice now, and the mud had come mostly out, but not entirely. There was a shadow on the hem from the Red Creek street, a permanent reminder of kneeling in the mud to gather her books while strangers walked past. The latch she'd repaired herself held solidly. The dress wasn't suitable for everyday wear, not in its current state, but she hadn't put it away for rags either, which she might have done practically with any other garment. She had thought, putting it away in October, about why she kept it. It was not a beautiful dress. It was not a dress that held pleasant memories. It was the dress she'd worn through 11 days of flooding and poor food and exhaustion, the dress that had arrived in Red Creek already defeated, and what it reminded her of was not the journey itself, but the particular quality of arriving at the end of it and finding something she hadn't known to look for. She had gotten on the stagecoach in Pennsylvania because she needed to do something different, because she had been standing still for 3 years and stillness had started to feel like disappearing. She had answered an advertisement for a practical arrangement, and she had told herself that practical was what she wanted, and she had been wrong. And being wrong had led her to exactly the right place. She thought about what she would tell herself if she could send a letter back to the woman sitting in the cold room in Harlow, the woman reading a short, careful letter from a man she'd never met and deciding whether to write back. She thought she would say, "Write back." She thought she would say, "The road is going to be terrible, and you are going to arrive with mud on your dress, and your trunk is going to fall open in the street, and none of that is going to matter as much as you think it will." She thought she would say, "You are more capable of this than you know, and what you are going to find there is not what you think you're looking for, and it is worth every mile." She thought she would also say, "The children are real. Be ready for the children to be real people immediately, because they are, and they will ask you for things you won't have a prepared answer for, and the best thing you can do is answer them honestly, even when the answer is, 'I don't know yet.'" She'd been honest. Mostly. She'd gotten some of it wrong. Pushed when she should have waited. Held back when she should have spoken. Misjudged the temperature of a room more than once. She had not been the picture of competence and patience that she'd described in her letters. She had been tired and uncertain and occasionally frustrated, and once, in the second week, she had gone to her room in the middle of the afternoon and sat on the edge of the bed and breathed through something that was very close to despair before getting up and going back downstairs. She was glad she'd gotten up. She was glad she'd gone back downstairs. On a Sunday in November, the first real snow of the season came down overnight and covered everything, and Clara saw it from her window in the early morning and made a sound that brought everyone upstairs to look. The ranch in the first snow was a different kind of beautiful from the ranch in any other season. Everything simplified, quieted. The rough edges of the yard and the unfinished fence sections and the imperfect garden all blurred under white. They stood at the window together, all four of them, Clara between her father and Evelyn, Henry slightly to the side but not separate, and nobody said anything for a while because there wasn't anything to say that would improve on the sight of it. Then Clara said, "Ferdinand is going to hate this." "Ferdinand is a crow," Henry said. "He'll manage." "He has feelings," Clara insisted. "He has very practical feelings," Henry said. "He'll find somewhere warm and he'll be fine." Silas looked down at Clara with an expression Evelyn had come to know well, the one that was love in its plainest form, unperformed, just present. Then he looked across the top of her head at Evelyn. She looked back. The snow kept coming down outside the window, steady and quiet, covering the road that came in from Red Creek, covering the garden, covering the fence line on the east side with its one still imperfect post. It covered the yard where she had stood that first morning, looking at the shape of work in progress, and understanding that she was looking at a man doing too many things alone. He was not alone now. Neither was she. Neither of them were the people who had written those careful letters. She was not reliable and patient and plain. He was not simply a practical man seeking a functional arrangement. They had both arrived at this kitchen table as one thing and become, slowly and with considerable difficulty and without any of it going as smoothly as anyone would have planned, something else. Something that had no clean name but didn't need one. That afternoon, Silas fixed the east fence post properly, and Evelyn held it while he set it, and Henry handed tools without being asked, and Clara stood nearby narrating the proceedings with the editorial confidence of someone who had strong opinions about fence post methodology. The cold was serious and the work was real, and nothing about it was romantic in the conventional sense. There was mud under the snow, and her hands were numb, and at one point the post slipped before it was set, and Silas said something under his breath that she pretended not to hear. When it was done, he stood back and looked at it. "Straight?" he asked. Evelyn looked at it. "Left side is a hair off." He looked again. "It'll hold." "It'll hold," she agreed. He looked at her. She looked at him. The post was a hair off, and it would hold, and the snow was still coming down, and there was supper to make, and a lemon balm on the windowsill that was going to smell like something worth keeping, and none of it was the life that either of them had originally mapped out for themselves, not remotely, and it was the truest thing either of them had ever been part of. "Come inside," Evelyn said. "I'll make coffee." "The good kind," Clara said immediately. "You're 7, Henry said. "I'm almost 8. "That changes nothing about the coffee." "Miss Evelyn," Clara appealed. "Mostly milk," Evelyn said. "Come inside." They came inside. The door closed against the cold, and the snow, and the wide, indifferent frontier sky, and the kitchen filled with the sound of people who had, through stubbornness and patience and the small daily choice to keep showing up, made themselves into something that worked. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but solidly. Like a fence post set in cold ground that holds because it was set with the right amount of effort by people who understood that some things you just had to keep coming back to until they were right. Not every wound heals clean. Not every road leads somewhere you expected. But some roads, if you stay on them long enough, lead somewhere better than anywhere you would have chosen for yourself. The blue dress stayed in the trunk. It stayed there as a reminder that the hardest roads don't announce themselves as necessary. They just look like difficulty, right up until the moment you arrive, muddy and exhausted and not at all what you promised in your letters, at the place that was always yours. You just didn't know it yet.